Hello, welcome to the first of our three-part series of Build Your Personal Website. This first part is going to cover the basics of HTML, CSS, and JS for creating a website. This workshop is the product of the collaboration between IEEE at UCSD and TSE. I personally am one of the IEEE technical chairs.
I'm a developer in TSE, or Trident Software Engineering, and we offer pro bono technological support through websites and apps for local nonprofits in San Diego.
So with that said, let's just get into the workshop now. And beforehand, we recommend you to visit JS Fiddle. I put the link in the chat. It's basically a useful environment where you can test out HTML, CSS, and or JS so that you can kind of see what's going on, because much of the workshop code in here won't necessarily have the visuals accompanying it. So yeah, it's quite useful if you want to see exactly what's going on. All right. So perhaps the first thing you want to know is, what exactly are web pages? What happens when you visit it? It's basically, what is the underlying foundation that results in the web page that we see? And essentially what happens is that our browser requests a resource from a server and displays it. And typically with web pages, this is an HTML document, but sometimes perhaps it's a PDF or image, right? So like perhaps if you've downloaded like a resume, that resume with a separate link, or like PowerPoint, for example. But yeah, so for HTML and CSS, these are specific types of files, kind of obviously, and the standards for them are maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. But it is up to the browser on how to interpret it. And this is why you can sometimes see differences in how browsers render web pages, perhaps most notably with like Internet Explorer not seeming to be able to do anything. But that's a different story. And so the browser's rendering engine then just parses this HTML and CSS to display on the screen. How does it get parsed? Essentially, HTML markup creates a parse tree known as the document object model, also known as the DOM. And it's basically an object representation of the HTML file. And it exposes HTML elements to be able to be modified through other languages such as JavaScript, which we will be covering. And the actual rendering of the web page is done by traversing DOM nodes, computing the behavior, which is sometimes controlled by the CSS along the way. And just to give like a general visual of what exactly I mean by the DOM, we've got a sample HTML file and its corresponding DOM there. Yeah. Okay. And so now the question is, what exactly is an HTML file? How do I understand it? So in general, HTML elements have the form of like an opening, like a less than, and then a greater than symbol. And then inside this is a tag name. So in this example, we have a tag known as a div. And now in between this tag and a closing tag, which is basically the same thing except with slash before the name of it, is typically the children, what's referred to as the children of the element. This can include other elements. It can include text, which becomes an element, and so on. There are a few exceptions, though. Particularly, some elements don't have any children. One such is an image. In this case, typically you'll have you can just directly close it with the slash and then the closing brace. And something to note: technically, you don't need the closing brace, but it's really recommended good practice to add it in just to make it clear. Yeah. Elements can also have attributes listed after the name of it. So basically, these attributes can affect the element's behavior. And they're separated by spaces inside the opening tag. So for example, over here, we have an image. Well, an image might need a source. Like, what is the image that we're displaying? And so in this case, we're saying we want to display the image lorem.jpg, which is somewhere inside the rest of our project. As for the actual HTML file structure, the typical HTML document has something looking like this. This is mostly referring to this is mostly pertaining to the metadata. So typically the top of an HTML document will have something like will have the first line being doc type HTML. This just tells the browser that this is an HTML document. Many browsers actually don't need this nowadays, but it is good for backwards compatibility. So yeah. Yeah. Then basically everything else is enclosed in an HTML opening and closing brace. And the first thing inside our HTML is the head. And this basically defines the metadata for a web page. What does this mean? Well, it includes things like the site title. It includes what the document is encoded as. It includes other resources that the document might use, such as, for example, CSS or JavaScript. And so now that we kind of have this general idea of what HTML looks like, let's just go into some of the HTML tags that you might see. Oh, and if anyone ever thinks I'm going too fast, just let me know, and I'll try to slow down. Yeah. Oh, and also for JS Fiddle, it basically will abstract away all this metadata stuff, so you can just work directly inside the content. Yeah, I should probably clarify that. All right. So one of the first things many people learn when working with HTML is just headings and paragraphs. So in general, HTML encourages the use of using semantic tags, which basically means there's a wide array of tags, and technically they could all serve the same purpose, but by using a specific tag, you're generally implying that whatever the contents of it are related to whatever the tag means. So for example, HTML has 6 headings. In theory, that means you should make your most important heading have the H1 tag, the second most important, the H2 tag, and so on for decreasing important headings. Now, these headings in HTML do have their own default text stylings, but these can be changed with things like CSS. In addition to headings, we also do have paragraphs. Paragraphs have their own text styling and their own slight behaviors. And yeah, so generally, just in general, you want to kind of make sure that whatever you're doing with your HTML, the tags kind of should convey at least the general meaning of whatever they're enclosing. And yeah, the slides will be shared as well. I will need to do that, but yeah. So some other things that are commonly used in HTML are links and images, for example. Links are represented with the A tag. A is short for anchor. Honestly, I don't know, but that's just how it is. Yeah. And the target of the link is specified with the href attribute. Honestly, I don't know what that means. So, but yeah, that's what the attribute is. And so typically you wrap a link around some text, for example, or you can wrap it around a button to have it such that when it's clicked, it will direct you to some link. Images are another very common element of websites. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, they are denoted with the image tag or IMG. They're typically written just with the opening and closing brace and everything enclosed with side because they're literally not allowed to have children elements. Typically with an image, you want to specify the source. This can be a URL or it can be the path to another file, which is like the image source that you're using. And typically you do also want to specify an alt attribute, which is basically what happens if this image doesn't load. Yeah. Moving on to lists. Lists are basically whenever we want to, for example, if you want to make a recipe, you may want to number out like this is the first step, this is the second step, and so on. Alternatively, sometimes you might want to have bullet points. Well, HTML supports both of these. You can create ordered lists, which are numbered with the OL tag, and unordered lists with the UL tag. And then list items are created with the LI tag. And you should probably only ever see LI tags enclosed within an ordered list or an unordered list. Yeah. So yeah, you guys can like put this into JS file. You can like observe how they're different, for example. And this would be like 1, 2, 3, and then this would just be bullet, bullet, bullet. Yeah. And so now we're going to go in a bit more perhaps general. So the HTML div tag is basically a divider, and it's commonly used to group elements together. Yeah. Basically, the div is very often used in conjunction with the class attribute. Now, the class attribute can be assigned to any element, but it's very commonly used with a div because the div doesn't necessarily have as much semantic meaning beside just saying like, hey, this is a group. And by using this class attribute, you can then select for it with CSS or JavaScript. So for example, here, if we want to group multiple images together, we can put them all inside a div. And then if we want to, for example, do something with this group of images by adding this images class to our div, we're able to access it later or easily select for it and then do what we do wish to do with them. Oh no, did I forget to link it? Oops. Okay, I guess we're going the long way. And I guess that's a preview. Okay, yeah. So moving on from HTML. So this is relatively brief. We're mostly going to be covering just like the most important HTML tags, CSS selectors, so on. And yeah, if you ever have any confusion, you can always like ask, or another good resource is Google, just because there is a very wide range of HTML tags, CSS properties, so on. Yeah. So moving on to CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's basically the language used for styling websites. This includes things like how our elements are going to be positioned, how they're going to be aligned, what fonts we're using, the colors, the size, etc. Because we don't always want a web page that looks like it was made in 1998. Now, CSS can be embedded directly into the HTML, but typically we want to keep it in an external file. So generally, we want to have HTML just define the structure, and then CSS define, for example, how it looks, basically. Now, CSS is basically composed of a bunch of rules, where each rule is composed of a selector and then a list of pairs. The selector specifies what elements should be styled. So the selector basically says, find every single element that fulfills these conditions. Yeah, and then the property is some aspect that needs to be of the element to style, and then the value is what exactly are we going to style it as. So how do we select things then? Well, our HTML element tags can be selected by the element. So if we want to select for every single div in our web page, we can just write div, and every single rule it'll be the selector and then semicolons, and then property value pairs are finished with semicolons, and the property has a colon after it. If we want to select for a class name, we can select it with a period and then the class name. So for example, if we have a div with the class, I don't know, like my class name, you could say dot my class name, and then that would select for every element that has the class name my class name. Likewise, with ID, you can select with the pound symbol or number symbol, however you want to call it, rather than the period as it was with class. Now, something unique about ID, ID is another attribute for HTML elements, but the ID has to be unique inside a web page. So this means that when you're selecting for an ID, you're basically guaranteed that you're selecting for only a specific HTML element. And if you want to, you can select every single HTML element in your entire page just with the star, asterisk, whatever you want to call it. But of course, sometimes we might want to be a bit more specific, right? What if we don't want to select, for example, every div? What if we want to select a div with a class name? Or what if we want to select a class name, but it has to be a div? Well, CSS does have many compound selectors as well. So for example, if you want to select an element of a type and a class name, you can specify the element and then dot class name. And you can kind of chain this together as well. Likewise, you can select elements with multiple classes in a similar manner. Also, sometimes you may find that you have multiple different elements, but you can't exactly select for all of them easily, but they all want the same styles. In this case, you can just use commas to specify multiple different selectors that you're going to apply these properties to all of. Also, sometimes you may want to only select, for example, a specific group of elements. So perhaps you want to select only the images that are inside a div. Well, you can use a space to separate your selectors. And it's basically going to scope your later selectors to only select within the elements that were selected by the earlier selectors. And perhaps you want to only target the direct children. So perhaps if you have like a list of lists and you only want to get the outer list, then you can just use the less than operator on the parent to only select for those direct children that match for your target selector. Now, CSS does also have something called pseudo classes. These are typically elements in a certain state. There's a very wide variety of them, but some of the most perhaps the most common one is just if you want to test if something's being hovered over, for example. So if you want with CSS, with the CSS colon hover, this basically means that you're going to select for all elements that match the selector when they are hovered. Pseudo classes can also select for things like, for example, the first child. So if you want to select for all the first child of every single list, you can do li colon first child. And yeah, as I stated, there are a ton of selectors. So it's not very feasible to cover all of them, and a lot of them honestly aren't used very much. But yeah, these should cover kind of the most basic and like most foundational and probably the most often used selectors when you are working with CSS. Now, because CSS values and properties are kind of like their own language, it is useful to kind of know the units, and particularly regarding the size and length. So CSS does support absolute length units, so it's like centimeters, millimeters, inches, and so on. But like, if you compare like someone on like an iPad or something, or like a desktop computer, and then someone on a phone, it really isn't necessarily the best idea to use them. Instead, people will often use pixels. And CSS pixels aren't exactly a one-to-one pixel mapping to the actual resolution of your screen. So typically, the pixels is relative to the viewing screen's device, or to the viewing device. So basically, a single pixel on your 4K monitor is not the same as a single pixel on some like tiny phone. Typically, your 4K monitor will use multiple pixels to represent one CSS pixel. Another unit of measure is called EM, or M. I don't know what it stands for, but it basically is a it's basically a factor relative to the current font size. So for example, if you say you want to make an element's size 2M, that's saying we're going to set it equal to 2 times the current size. This does cause issues though, because the sizes do vary between elements and between parents. This can mean that 2M between 2 different elements can mean very different meanings for the actual size. So instead, people often will use rem instead, or root m. This is kind of similar to m, except rather than relative to the font size or to the parent size, it's relative to the root's font size. And this makes it basically like, so for example, if your root font size is 12, this basically means your rem size is basically always pix divided by 12 if your root font size is 12. Some other ones that you might see are VW or VH, which is the viewport width or height. So typically you might see this with, for example, if you want something to take up the entire page, you can use viewport width or viewport height to basically say, I want this to be 100% of the viewport width and 100% of the viewport height to basically occupy the entire screen. And then you can always use percent, which is basically a percent relative size to the parent element. Yeah. And now let's move on to styling text. So CSS has a fairly comprehensive list of properties for styling text. Text color can just be selected by color. This color can be either one of the many defaults that CSS provides. So for example, you can just put red. You can also put things like hex colors. You can put RGBA. You can put like HSL, so on. There's like a wide variety of colors supported. Yeah. Now, one of the things that many websites do want their own custom like theme, and probably one of the best ways to do that is the font. So in CSS, you can specify the font that you wish your text to be. It's called font family because like you might want bold, italics, so on. And yeah, and in case there are issues with loading a font, you can also list use a comma separated list of kind of fallbacks or backups. So basically, for example, in this case, if somehow Arial failed, we're going to try to use sans serif instead. We can also specify the font size, which is just how large is this text going to be. I don't know if there's much explained that needs to be said here. As stated before, it's typically going to be in pixels or rem. There's also the line height, which is how much space is this text occupying. So you may know this as the I need 10 pages on my essay and I really need to add in some more pages. Let me change the line spacing. It's kind of like that. If you've ever had to worry about writing out an essay with too many pages. And yeah, so by default, the line height will be a multiple of the font size. But if you do apply units, for example, you can just directly specify, I want this to be 24 pixels tall for line height. And you can also specify how the text should be aligned in its container. This is typically horizontally, so you can have it be aligned in the center, to the left, or to the right. Yeah. Now, CSS can also let us control what position our element's going to be in. So basically, with the position, you can specify there are several different modes of positioning. They each have kind of their own quirks, and it would honestly take quite a long time to go through all of them. But in general, some of the more common used positionings are absolute, fixed, and relative, for example. Yeah, they have their own quirks. It'd take quite a while to go through them. So yeah. From there, you can then specify, for example, how much the position of the element is going to be offset from its context. And this context is in part influenced by the positioning that you select or that you choose for the element, or perhaps its parents. And as you can see, the position offset can be like basically any unit you want, as usual. In general, most of the CSS properties can take in pretty much any of the units. Another one of the positioning selectors is the float. The float basically tells where the element should be positioned inside of its container. So for example, if you have multiple elements, but you want one of them, for example, to be on the very right of the page and the rest on the left, you can just have that one that you want to be on the right float to the right and have your container span the whole page or the whole width. And then there's also the Z index. Z index is basically like, suppose you're stacking the elements like on a piece of paper or something, and they're all like 2D. Basically, you're going to be putting them on the page in order of increasing Z index. So basically, the stuff with larger Z index is going to appear like on top. So basically, like this can be used for like overlays, for example. Or if you want to hide something, you can use a Z index to basically just put it on top of another element. Yeah. So now let's go over the actual HTML element. So every single HTML element is represented by a rectangular box. And this box this box model kind of describes how this HTML element is represented. So each HTML element is or box is represented with a margin, a border, a padding, and then the actual content. So the margin is typically transparent, and basically, you can think of it like internal padding for the margin. So for example, if you know that some content is going to be in some certain box of area, if you add margin to it, it's going to the actual area box is going to remain the same, and all it means is that the content inside the box is going to shrink. In contrast, you have padding, which kind of pads the content with extra space. So with padding, for example, then you might observe things like the size of your element appearing to increase because the padding is added to the outside of your content. You can also specify the width and height of your content. This is only the content, and it doesn't include the padding, it doesn't include the border, and it doesn't include the margin. Yeah, oftentimes the margins and padding may be set to 0. So in that case, it may actually be representative of how large your element is. But in other cases where you may have padding, this isn't necessarily the case. And then there's the border. Honestly, it's just a border. Yeah, the border, this border here in our sample code is a shorthand for basically the border width, the border style, and then the border color. Yeah. With the border, you can also round its corners. So if you want like a rounded button, you can do that. Another trick is if you set the border radius to a very large number, it will never exceed 50%. So this can, for example, make you a circular button just by making the border radius 50% and having a square box. You can also set the background of the content. It can be a color, it can be an image, yeah. And with the image, you probably have to use URL and then path the image, or like, I don't know, the URL of the image, yeah. And then for the actual content and the box, you can also set the display. The display is basically the type of box. By default, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of similar to positioning in that there are quite a few modes, and it take quite a bit to elaborate on all the details per se of the different display types. But we will be mostly just going into one specific use case of it, which is the flex box. Yeah, and so the flex box is a box type that allows the container to dynamically alter the size and order to fit available space. The recording will be uploaded sometime. Yeah, I'm not sure when, but yeah. And yeah, so basically the flex box is a certain type of display where the element with the flex display is referred to as the flex container, and then its contexts are referred to as the flex items. One of the most common uses of flex box is to center items. So basically, because it allows you to dynamically alter the size and dynamically basically adjust where your content is going to be, it does have these useful properties, align items and justify content, where align items basically says we're going to center this on its off axis, which is in the case of a normal. So basically flex has its own flow. By default, this is like left to right, right? So basically align items will be along the cross axis, which basically means vertically we're going to put this in the center of the container. And while justify content is horizontally, we're going to put this in the center as well. So these two together basically ensure that all your children will be aligned vertically and horizontally in the center. And so yeah, to kind of go into some flex container properties, with Flexbox, you can specify what direction they're being placed. So you can specify it's a row, you can specify it's column, or there's also row reverse or column reverse if you want to go from right to left or down and up. Flexbox also by default is all contained to a single line. So you can change that with flex wrap, and you can specify it to be wrap, for example. As I mentioned before, justify content tells how items should be aligned along the main axis, or the direction that the flex is going. And align items is how they should be aligned along the cross axis. There is also align content. This is mostly just for, in the case there are multiple lines, how should we align that? Yeah. Meanwhile, flex items have their own flex properties as well. So basically, if the parent is a flex box, then you can also use these properties to kind of set their behavior inside the flex context, I guess. So one such flex item property is the order. By default, the flex box will just put the items in order that they were seen in the HTML. But if you want, you can put them in a different order. Although honestly, I don't think this is used very much. Perhaps more often used is things like flex grow or flex shrink. Flex grow basically says, so the flex container has some certain space, and if all the items inside don't necessarily take up the entirety of the space, how are you going to use that space? Who's going to take it? And flex grow is basically relatively how much space is this item going to take compared to the other items flex grow. By default, flex grow is 0. So for example, you have a single item with a non-zero flex grow, and the rest are all 0. That basically means that item with the non-zero flex grow will basically take up all the remaining space. Flex shrink is kind of the other way around, which is in the case the container is smaller than it ideally is, then how much space will this item lose compared to other items when you're shrinking it? And then the flex basis is basically the default amount of space that the item should take up. You can kind of think of it like the default size, I guess. And that said, let's move on to transitions. CSS transitions are kind of like almost a way of fully animating elements, basically. So CSS transitions basically allow supported property values to smoothly change over duration. Basically, it means that when the property value does change for that element, we're going to say we're basically going to listen to that property value, and once it does change, we're going to take the change value and then we're going to interpolate it in some way. So typically the transition is written in shorthand, where you have optional if it's only one, but otherwise it's the property that you're going to listen to changes for, how long it's going to take, and then the easing, which is basically in what manner should it transition. So you can have it do a linear easing, which basically means just like constant velocity, I guess, just smooth transition. You can do ease in. There are basically a couple built-ins for easing. And then a commonly used one is cubic Bezier, which is basically you just get a lot more control with cubic Bezier. Yeah, basically this is x, y, x, y. So a cubic Bezier is a curve with 4 points. By default, it's the first one's 0, 0, and the last one's 1, 1. And so this one, for example, is saying we're going to have a point at 0.215, 0.610, and then one at 0.351. And then we're going to construct the Bezier curve from that. And basically, we use that resultant Bezier curve to model how much it should change from 0 to 100% of the duration. Yeah. And so now that we've kind of covered the basics of HTML and CSS, I'll be passing it over to Drew to talk about JavaScript.
All right, cool. So basically, JavaScript is the language that's used to modify the behavior of HTML elements, whereas HTML is the markup acting as the markup language acting as the skeleton of the website, giving the text and tags associated with that text, and CSS acts as the styling of those specific tags. JavaScript includes any simple user interaction with the website and even a couple things like animations. So similarly to how we included a link towards our CSS file in the head of our HTML file, we also include the same for our script, which is script type equals text slash JavaScript and src equals script.js. And like CSS, JavaScript can be embedded directly into the HTML file. If you do this in GSFiddle, you'll see a different tab for JavaScript, but it is typically written in an external file and then linked, similar to how it's linked here. So previously, William mentioned the document object model, or the DOM, which is basically just the way JavaScript and HTML elements can interact with each other. The document object contains every single tag that is used in the form, well, this is a visualization in the form of a tree, and each thing is related to its child and parent. So for example, HTML would be the highest tag. Below that, there's a head tag, and below that there's a body tag, and the body tag contains respective elements such as an anchor element and an H1 and a header 1 element. So from the document, HTML elements can be selected through several different ways. We can get the single element of a specified ID. For example, a const myl, and we can use document.get element by ID and reference the ID name to get a certain element. We can get all elements with a class name, since class names don't have to be unique and they can include multiple different elements. So whereas ID just gets the first element or the only element, class names will get all the elements with the specific class name red. We can get the first element matching a specific CSS selector. For example, query selector li returns the first instance of a list, and query selector all just returns all entries of that list. And once it's saved in that const, we can just reference it afterwards, and we can modify those elements. Cool. So JavaScript elements can have their properties edited, and they can also be reflected then in the DOM. For example, we have, let's say, some HTML code or some code in our HTML file, which has a div with an ID of sample. We can reference this using const element equals document.get element by ID sample. And once we've declared element as a const, as basically a variable, we can modify in several different ways. We can set the HTML contents of the element by using element.innerHTML, and you can see that we still include the H1 and H1 opening and closing tags, because it essentially just overrides whatever text was there, and not just the text of the tag, but the entire text. We can set the class name to a new element. So for example, we can set this element to have a class name of myDiv. We can also add, remove, or toggle a class to the element. For example, the class list is a variable for JavaScript DOM objects that basically just contains all the classes they're a part of. And I think you can guess what hidden is. So adding hidden would just mean that the element would now be hidden. Removing hidden would mean that it's non-hidden anymore. And toggle is just a way of changing back and forth between hidden. And similarly to CSS, we can also modify the CSS properties of an element, just like we could in HTML. So element, and this is used by the element.style, and then we can reference the exact same CSS properties. So color, font family, border, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, and just something to note, because JavaScript does have certain reserved keywords like class, that's why you have to say class name. And then likewise, you can't use the dashes inside your variables, which is why it's font family with a capital F rather than font dash family.
Cool. So one of the main reasons we like using JavaScript is because we can run custom functions to when an event occurs. And an event is basically any sort of action that can take place, either whether it be a user interaction with the website or it'd be something that happens once the website loads. We can access and assign events to certain elements using the document object model. And this usually typically follows the format an element, which is an HTML tag, followed by an event, and then some JavaScript code within it. Just an example, let's say our element is h1, and as we click that element, we'd like the inner HTML to change from click on this text to changed. So if we include this code, basically what happens is as soon as you click on this h1 tag, then the text will change. This is one way of doing it using inline JavaScript. We can also use a script tag, whereas we include a function called change text that takes a parameter of ID and sets that ID to ID's inner HTML to changed. This references the element itself. So basically it just does this dot inner HTML. So essentially h1 dot inner HTML changed for this specific tag, and it has the same purpose as this. And we can also use a specific JavaScript function, which is onClick, and within your JS file. So this is outside of the HTML file that you have. You declare a function as a const, and you can mention it is the exact same code. So document.get element by ID dot inner HTML, and it becomes changed. So we can use events to control user input and output and maintain user interaction. So things like on key up can track if a certain keystroke has been made. On mouse over can track if a mouse hovers over a specific element. On mouse down can track when a mouse key is clicked. There's mouse elements that can allow you to see the amount of time a mouse has been pressed for. We can use these events for the eventual personal website that we make, especially in the form of a submission form, where we use the event on submit to keep track of when a submit button is pressed. So that means we can take all the information from a contact form and then finally send that to an email. And we'll be covering all of this in next week's lesson. William, do you want to talk about animations a bit more?
Yeah, so when we talked about CSS transitions, we mentioned how you can define transitions for when a property has changed for the element. And so JS is the way for actually causing these changes in the element. One of the most common ways to do so is by adding or removing classes, for example. So perhaps one of the more trivial ones is for showing or hiding an element. In some of our examples CSS earlier, or JavaScript, we showed how you could kind of toggle or add or remove a class called hidden. And you can use this, for example, when you want to hide an object and show it again with smooth transitions. So for example, in this example code, we have a button, and when we click it, we're going to hide this paragraph with the content, hello world. And so in our CSS, we're basically going to say this text is going to be, by default, it's just going to be fully opaque. But if the opacity does change, we're going to have it change over the span of 1 second. And so in our JavaScript code, our button does have an onClick to call for the onClick function. And so inside our JavaScript, we've defined our onClick function to say we're going to select the first element with class name text. In this case, because it's a trivial example, there's only one. And then we're going to toggle the class hidden on it. So basically, if initially our text is just, or our paragraph just has a class text, when we first click the button, it's going to add hidden, and CSS, it's going to it's going to see this, it matches text, so it sets opacity to 1 and it says, okay, we're going to listen to changes in opacity, and if it does, we're going to do it over 1 second. And then because CSS has basically increasing or cascading styles, basically what you see later was going to overwrite it. So since it's also hidden, it's going to now override the opacity from 1 to 0. And now that the opacity has changed, it's going to smoothly transition from the 1 to 0 over the duration of 1 second. And once you remove the hidden, this no longer applies. So the opacity is now changed from 0 to 1. And once again, it'll smoothly transition to show again. And yeah, so that's our brief rundown of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you do want to see more about these or about some of the more obscure things, there are some here. But for now, we're going to pass it over back to Drew, and he's going to help us make first just a basic personal website using just HTML, CSS, and JS. And we're going to do this on JS Fiddle because it is relatively convenient. Yeah.
All right, cool. Before that, does any firstly, we don't expect any of you to just remember all of that, so we sent these slides in the chat, and this video is also, this Zoom call is also being recorded, so if you want to refer back to anything, you can always come back. Does anyone have any specific questions before we move on to the JS Fiddle section? Okay, cool. I guess we can move on. Oh, okay, so I'll just quickly share my screen right now. So if you go to jsfiddle.net, you should be able to see a website, something just like this. I've changed the layout settings a tiny bit. So if you want to do that as well, you can go to settings and you can just click on tabs, columns. I just think it looks the best, and because vertical space is a lot more valuable than horizontal space. So you can see we have a tab for our HTML, our JavaScript, and our CSS. We can move these around however we like. And basically, we'll just be using this as the fundamental, as just the basis for a personal website. This isn't what our final project is going to be, but this is just an idea of how we can get started. So an HTML file will always begin with doc type HTML, just to let the browser know that this is an HTML file. And we'll start off with the HTML tags. Within these, we can include a header tag, and this essentially just, well, we don't need to include it right now because JS Fiddle handles it for us. This will include things like our title, links to CSS and JS, and any other metadata that we want to include that isn't on the actual front of the website. Moving on from that, we can now create a body. And within that, the way I think about personal websites is, at its core, it's a bit like your resume. So we're going to structure a bit like that. We're going to include a header to say your name. We're going to include a link to your resume, which can be a PDF or a Google Docs link or the tech link. I heard some people do that. And we'll include different sections for education, projects, and experience. And yeah, we'll just start off with that. So cool. So I'll start off with a header. Since I'm making this website for myself, I'll just put my name. But if you're following along on JS Fiddle as well, feel free to include your name. So after that, we can include an image of ourselves. So the basic format is an IMG and then SRC equals whatever image you have. I had an image saved earlier, so I'll come back to that. Another great thing about HTML is you can include just a simple HR tag, which stands for horizontal row. And that basically just creates a line that separates your sections and makes things look a lot more cleaner. So from here on, we can move on to the next section, which is, I think I said education. So since this is a smaller, we don't want it to be an H1 tag since it's a small subsection. So maybe we'll keep it an H3. Let's say education, put another HR there. Experience, HR, and finally projects. Okay, and if at any point we want to see what this looks like, we can just hit save, or we can hit run on over here, and it should show me just like the raw HTML because we haven't had any stylings. We haven't made it look pretty anyway yet. So this is the basis that I want to work off. And from here on, I'll add different components from what we've learned and basically fill in the gaps. So for an education, since it'd just be one line that includes UC San Diego and when I'm expected to graduate, I can include that as just a simple paragraph tag. So cool. For experience, since it makes sense to include experience as a list, we might want to use an unordered list to show what we've done so far and maybe the different places we've worked at or the different orgs we've been a part of. So I'll create an unordered list and there'll be a list item for each. I'll just include 3 list items for now. Cool. And for projects, we might want to include a list, or the main important thing is that each project is a link. We'd want to redirect it to either a demo, or we'd want to redirect it either to the GitHub repository for that project. Including projects this way is really helpful, and because you can't always do that in your resume. So having a centralized place where all your projects are just visible is really useful. So yeah, we can create separate anchor tags as hyperlinks for our different projects. I'll just put this cool. Then we can hit save and we should get something like this now. So obviously this doesn't look the prettiest. We want to style this a bit more. So now we can start heading into CSS and see what we can do to make it look, what we can do to add some, make it look not like it was just made in 1995. So for CSS, we can, first thing we can change the font family of any text tags. So I don't know. Would you say like this is fine, or should I just like reference each of the?
I guess. I mean,
I guess yeah, it's not the best, is it? I'll reference
yeah.
it like individually. All right. So we've used an H1 tag, an H3 tag, and a P tag, and an L tag. So we can set the font family of this. Let's say Arial. Wait. Cool. And you can see that that updates the font family as well. One thing that might help with our CSS is adding IDs to all of our different sections. So we might want to set an ID of this to our header. We want to set this to education, experience, projects. So we'll just quickly go ahead and do that. So I'll set this to name, ID equals education, ID equals experience, and ID equals projects. So now, since we've set an ID to everything, we can start referencing these individual sections. So let's say I want to take this header, which I've created, which is my name, and just change it. So we can reference IDs by, I'm forgetting, our IDs pound signs or IDs periods? Pound signs, right? Okay, all right, so cool. So we have a name right here. So let's say I want to center align the text. We can do that. Now it's in the center. We can do this for multiple different tags if we want. So let's say I want to do that for education too. That happens because this specific H3 tag we said was going to be center aligned. We'll leave that for now. To add styling to the entire page, we can reference the body tag, because essentially all of our items are underneath that. So we could maybe add a background color. Let me look for something that looks cool. Yeah, so this doesn't look too bad. All right. So what I just did there was copy the HTML hex code for this kind of mint green color that I found. And once we do that, we can set background color to that, and basically that'll show up. Cool. So essentially, this is just the start of all the things we can do. And this is the start of a structure that you can follow when you're going to maybe making a personal website. We're going to be using a library, a framework known as React, which is a JavaScript framework, and that helps us create the specific components in a lot more nicer fashion. So, but for the basics of understanding HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, this is a typical structure that you might want to follow. And yeah, I think I can't think of too much else to add right now other than just CSS, but maybe it might be helpful underneath our image to include a resume. So we'll just, whenever you're at # with the hyperreference for the anchor, and that just means it doesn't need to go anywhere, so it just stays in place. So once I add that, it shows up there. I can add a JavaScript event similar to just we done. So just once the resume has been clicked, so on click, I can add some code to just alert the user that the file, whether the file has been found or not, or just saying. So once I click on Hang on. There it is. Okay. So the alert tag basically just shows a pop-up that with any specified text here that you specified. So that's something you can use as well. Okay, so I
Oh,
see some in the chat. Yeah. Is there a benefit to doing this versus using a site like Wix? I think definitely. The main one is just customizability and the ability to keep adding on and the ability to change stuff. So when we touch on this in next week's session, when we do React, you'll actually see a lot more. And the last session, we'll just be putting together everything we've learned so far. With things like Wix, I think it's free, and drag and drop interfaces can be really good, but and basically having full control over your website can be just can be beneficial.
yeah. And so with that, I think that basically concludes our workshop. If you have any questions, like if you were trying to like work on something or like try to get something to work, you could probably just ask it right now. I'm probably going to be stopping the recording now because there isn't much more to record. But yeah, if you have like any questions or like want to fix something, you could just like put in chat or something. I don't know if everyone's allowed to share the screen, but like you could like share the screen of what you have, and then we can maybe like try to help you make what you're trying to make.